Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome you once again on this Wednesday evening, the 13th of July, to Wednesday nights with myself, Inayet Wadee, where we take a look at issues and have a detailed discussion. We have a group of panelists who join in on the discussion and looking at topical issues. And one topical issue that we are keeping an eye on and tracking are the developments out in Sri Lanka. Now, for many of us, we've seen what has happened is people obviously storming the Prime Minister and the President and politicians' residence as a result of a number of issues. And some of the key issues, in fact, most of the issues are economically related. And when one looks at things like a lack of power, we're looking at high fuel costs, we're looking at lack of jobs. And this is a country that has so much potential, and we know it's a very, very fertile country as well. And the key issue here is what does this actually mean for countries that are in a similar predicament? And looking at South Africa, looking at our very own woes, looking at where we are economically, looking at where we are as far as service delivery goes, the power problems, Eskom, the ongoing power cuts, which people are actually getting tired of, unemployment, looking at the high unemployment rate in the country, and also at the same time looking at government, looking at corruption, all these things, the rising cost of living, the fuel price, all of this is a compounded problem. And these are issues, if they are not addressed, it means one thing, that countries like Sri Lanka and some other countries could be ripe for revolution. And that is what we are talking about. And this is what we are looking at and asking the question, can South Africa's woes trigger a Sri Lankan-like revolution in this country? And joining us are our two guests. We've got panelists, Dr. Pali Lehohla, the Director of Economic Modeling Academy, and we've got Tessa Dooms, who is the Director at Rivonia Cycle, with us this evening. Dr. Pali, firstly, good evening to you, sir, and welcome to the show.
Good evening, sir. Salam alaikum. And Tessa, good evening.
Yes, and Tessa, welcome to you as well. And we appreciate the fact that you've taken time out to talk to us this evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Right. Dr. Pali, let's just start off and let's just look at some of these triggers for revolution. Now, we looked at some of these issues. We looked at broad brush. We've just looked at some of the issues that this country is faced with and looking at what has taken place in Sri Lanka. And at some point in time, and this was predicted a number of years ago, that something has got to give, because people are going to get tired. People are going to go hungry. People are going to be without jobs. And all of these are triggers for revolutions. And are you surprised, firstly, that something like this has happened in Sri Lanka already?
It took a bit of time in Sri Lanka because I worked with one Sri Lankan as a member of the independent panel for the health of women and adolescents and children of the UN, appointed Ban Ki-moon. And the colleague there was always saying that Sri Lanka is on the edge. It took about 5 years to be where it is. So it ultimately happens. Human agency cannot be stopped. It's something that is very powerful. It's an innate gift. It's an innate property that human beings are their greatest liberators. So it happened in Sri Lanka. It was long coming.
Well, certainly. And also, Tessa, just looking at, just briefly an overview on your thoughts before we actually get into the detail and look at certain specific issues. And I know, for a long time, you've been talking about the youth, the future of the country as well. And looking at, countries like Sri Lanka, where we see young people obviously tired, without jobs. South Africa, a similar scenario is evolving, where we are reaching a stage where the youth are absolutely losing hope in the country, in the politicians, in the ruling governments. And these, again, talking about the triggers for a revolution. I'm sure, that is very, very strong, right at the forefront of your mind and thinking as well, Tessa.
Yeah, I think a few days ago I had the opportunity to speak to Reverend Frank Chikane on a podcast I do, and he made an interesting point about what led to the June 16 riots in '76. He spoke about the idea that what had effectively taken place is the political leadership in the country had been sent into exile, banned, imprisoned. All of that was happening, and an older generation of people's political voices were silenced. And even as students at the time, he was part of a generation of people who felt their political voices were silenced. And even though they were experiencing the same things that the 76 teenagers experienced, the 76 teenagers came and said, "We will not stand for the things that you stood for." And I think about a few weeks ago when we had another racist incident at Stellenbosch University, where a young student said, this is not the generation that's going to be quiet in the ways that other generations may have stood back. We're going to be a generation that does something different. So I think we must be aware that every generation is going to have things that they won't tolerate, things that they won't just think of as the status quo. As people not only mature in their lives, but sometimes we're born into situations or we come to accept certain situations that another generation of people just say, the thing that you thought was acceptable, we find completely unacceptable. And I think we're going to figure out, and we are starting to figure out what the kinds of things are that not only young people, but people who in this country experience the greatest burdens of poverty, of marginalization, of unemployment, and of poor service delivery, at some point will say there are certain things that you might, as the rest of society take, that I'm not going to take. And I think we're fast approaching those moments in different ways.
Well, it is a scary thought, Dr. Pali, from what Tessa says. We're fast approaching that scenario because if we look at what has happened in Sri Lanka, when we look at the popular support, when one looks at the tension, when one looks at the instability that has led to the crisis that we see in Sri Lanka, and popular fury is understandable, it is comprehensible, when one analyzes the thing, when one looks at it at a national level and what people actually experience in those countries.
Oh yes, I mean, as I said, it was long coming, and it has happened in many other parts of Africa, particularly North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, have had this kind of thing, and then of course it came to the Sudan, and of course to some limited extent in Zimbabwe, where there was a local arrangement where people were saying enough is enough, and the President Mugabe had to go, but was replaced within a party system. I think a similar muting of the changes occurred here in South Africa when President Zuma left and then President Ramaphosa came in. Obviously, the manifestation of pressures were there in the political systems and amongst the people. But the pressure was sort of managed by changing the heads of political parties. But eventually, people ran out of rope. So those tactics, if they don't deliver what people expect, a popular rising is quite inevitable. And in South Africa, it was so. The Feast Must Fall was part of the uprising that followed on June 1976. So it would be very unsurprising, obviously, when that may happen in South Africa. One doesn't wish it to happen, but the conditions and the evidence is very clear that when the youth in 2008 had 1.7 million more people employed in the age group 15 to 24 or to 34, and now that they are less that number of 1.0 to almost 2 million, less in absolute terms, while all other age groups are increasing in terms of employment, albeit high unemployment still prevailing. But when the youth lose their share that they had in 2008, in absolute terms, and they are the fastest growing group, then things are not lacquer for the youth at all. They don't see the future, and they have to make their future.
Yes, and Tessa, also from what Dr. Pali says, we're talking about obviously the youth is one aspect, but we're also looking at basically the entire country. We're looking at the entire population. We are looking at the older generation that are concerned about the future of the youth, about where they are, and considering where we are as a country right now. And as we have seen in the case of Sri Lanka, where the politicians have now come under severe pressure to the extent that their residences were stormed, to the extent that where they've had to actually flee. And this is the scary scenario where, when we're talking about, the triggers for a revolution, and people can only take so much. And I think the country as a whole, at this point in time, is at a crossroads where we are fast heading towards, that scenario where we say enough is enough and something has got to give, Tessa.
I mean, the country's been at a crossroads for about 2 decades now, if we're really honest. I think we went through a honeymoon phase in the 90s when it came to our democracy, where we didn't have as many, even just localized protests, what we've come to generally think of as service delivery protests, but are really protests against inequality and poverty and marginalization as well, not just services that are not being delivered by a municipality. And we mustn't think that just because we're not seeing mass demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people in the street, that South Africans haven't been showing their discontent. A few years ago, a study came out that showed that we have over 1,000 protests in this country a year. That is not an insignificant number. That's actually a very, very high and worrying number in a country of this size. You don't have that similar amount of protests in countries that are double and triple our size. And so our country has been at a point of discontent for a long time and continues to be. Because they had this kind of gravitas in our popular media. But it's the small protests, the daily protests, the small points of discontent, and how quickly people are able to organize themselves in protest that are already a signal. What is different in the last few years is that people have started to lose faith in democracy altogether. People used to protest in our country because they believed in democracy, and they believed that democracy gave them a right to protest, and that if you protest, you'll get a response. Now there's actually a sense that people have given up on the democracy, given up on its institutions. You can see it in the mass just voter non-participation. People saying we're not going to show up at the polls because we're unhappy with X party or Y party. We don't trust the entirety of the system. And that's what leads you to a Sri Lanka. It leads you to the point where people say, we're not going to stand for the institutions and the systems telling us what to do when those institutions don't work for us. And if we don't start addressing that question, the question of how we are losing hope in our democracy and how we regain it, then we lead ourselves down a path that I think it will be hard to come back from.
Dr. Pali, Tessa says, the honeymoon period is over now. The marriage is actually turning very, very ugly from, what we are hearing. Where have we gone wrong?
Well, I think it all went wrong around the transition in 94. But one actually should step back and say, what was the left agenda? The left agenda proposed the RDP. And there was very little left of the left agenda globally, because Milton Friedman had convinced the world that greed is good and capitalism is good. There was no Russia. China was trying to find its feet. on the continent of Africa, whatever was left of the left was Mozambique and Angola, and it didn't inspire any confidence. So when you look at South Africa emerging around that period, alone in a world that was becoming unipolar with capitalism, it was very difficult, I think, to survive, not falling for the Montclair scenarios, which argued for a different economic policy, which was driven largely by the IMF and the World Bank. And we chose our own austerity program of GEAR. But within a few years, this showed that it was not working. And then there was Giza that came into place, and we saw some growth, economic growth of up to 5%. We flirted with that. And unemployment dropped from 30% to 22%. Then, boom, came 2008, Pulukwani came, and 2008 financial crisis also came. And we went back to our comfort zone of GEAR Mark II. And then, of course, corruption came and all these other things came. But fundamentally, our economic policies and our social policies have not been in sync in terms of delivering the fruits of democracy, even if it is progressive. Definitively, from about 2012, the gains of progressive realization of democracy began to corrode. And so for the last 10 years, those gains have actually corroded so badly that with COVID, with floods, with fires, things have actually gone. And now with no fire whatsoever, because ESCOM, as I speak, I'm speaking in the dark. And you can see that government doesn't have any solution to the ESCOM problem. You cannot wake up in the morning and say, now today we are more serious about ESCOM. That has been in trouble for the last 10 years. I mean, you should be taking South Africans for granted to say that now we are more serious. And the Unity project of the ANC that actually took us, hold us, ball us with it down that path is part of the thing that has to blame, because it actually drained us altogether. It is in the economic policies that are totally wrong, neoliberal, and selling assets that serve the poor best. And the excuse is that those assets don't work. The question is, how did they work under apartheid? It is all about people. It's not about the wrong of ESCOM. ESCOM was destroyed by the ruling party. So we cannot say that ESCOM innately had this wrong DNA. There is something wrong in the DNA of the people that govern or rule. So we are in this space now where the promise of democracy, if you look at it progressively, has generated worse outcomes, save for some of the bright lights that came around 2003 or from 1996 to about 2010. Beyond that point, things turned south. There's not been any growth in the economy whatsoever during that period. In the last 24 quarters, 16 quarters of that are negative. Those that are positive are not anyhow major positive. Gross capital formation has been negative throughout, despite several investment conferences. Now, if we think about energy, we are saying that we should go for the green, which is fine. But Germany and all the West that has encouraged us to go green for a good reason, it looks like it was not for a good reason, because they, at the slightest inconvenience of Russia turning off the gas, or they themselves imposing sanctions on Russia not to buy their gas, are buying coal, South African coal, to fire their coal plants. So we are in that space, and we want to use green where we don't have the technology, where we don't have the plants, and we don't have any of that stuff at the moment. And we hope that we can resolve the current problem using those technologies that we don't have, and avoiding and ignoring the coal and the coal-fired plants that we have currently. It boggles the mind. It takes
Well, clearly,
something
Dr.
about the
Pali,
thinking.
I agree. And also, Tessa, I think this is the other scary thought as well, where one looks at the youth, for instance, since 1994, we 28 years into a democracy. And this is where question marks are actually raised whether democracy has really worked, because we are talking about a generation of youth for 28 years that have grown up, that have been born, that have grown up, that have been educated, that have gone through higher education institutions throughout their lives. And now they are at that age, the age of around 28. This is where they need to start thinking about themselves. They need to start thinking about a future. They need to start thinking about a career. They've had dreams, but these dreams are being dashed. These dreams are being, I have not realized, for the very reason that Dr. Pali has been talking about. Something obviously when we speak about 2008, the global market crashing, we know what has happened under the Zuma era as well. All of that put together has clearly dashed any hopes that the youth have for a bright future in this country.
I would say that South Africa's most fundamental problem has historically been and is still exactly the same, and that's inequality. We have made attempts at best to deal with poverty through a low base of social protection, a social protection that really does not cover a wide span. But we've done some work around that. We obsessively talk about unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment. The thing we have shied away from this country in resolving is the question of inequality. We came from a grossly unequal system, which was apartheid, which was colonialism. And what we did is we took those same structures and we just simply changed the faces of the people at the top, and we changed the ways in which it operates in terms of allowing people of different racial groups to occupy places of privilege, and then just kept the system as it was. And so you have the most unequal country in the world, and we wonder why it is that people are unhappy, why there's so much discontent. It's not hard, because there's one thing understanding that we have an issue around growth, which we absolutely do. But people also don't have much hope that if you have growth, it will actually impact on everybody positively in the same ways. Because we also know we have a very monopolistic and capital concentrated economy. We also know that we have very poor regard for wages and valuing people's wages. We know the disparities that we have, even just in terms of service delivery. You'll see in the same city, not even in the same city, within the same radius of 500 meters, you can find somebody whose services are being delivered on time and everything runs and everything's done well for them, and somebody who's absolutely not getting any services at all. Part of where we are as a country right now is that we're having to deal with the implications of inequality. And the implications of inequality are that you have a smaller and smaller group of people whose entire ability to exist and have the lifestyles that they have is now contingent on a system where the majority are not catered to. And that's something we're going to have to address. We're going to have to address our own senses of privilege. I'll never forget sitting during the July riots and realizing that even though I was less than a half an hour, not even a half an hour, away from where looting was happening, because South Africa is so unequal and we have at least 2 or 3 South Africas, that there are ways in which I could have insulated myself from that entire experience if I chose to. We've privatized education, we're privatizing security, we're privatizing so many basic things. We've started privatizing the fire service because there's a group of people who are able to do that in this country, and it comes at this expense of having a system that does not cater to the majority. Unless we address that, we are just replicating various forms of inequality and unequal systems like apartheid was, and not naming it and not thinking that it needs to go away. The other issues around leadership I can also address, because there are certainly issues around leadership and the competence of the state. But we have to talk about the big elephant in the room, which is inequality.
Well, certainly, Tessa, and you make a very valid point when it comes to inequality. And also Dr. Pali, today I just got a message where someone mentioned that we've had more millionaires and billionaires come out of Robben Island than all the universities put together in South Africa. Now, this thing obviously was said tongue in cheek, but this is something that is concerning because, Tessa is speaking about leadership. And just your thoughts on leadership, looking at South Africa since we become a democracy from the Mandela era through the Mbeki era, Zuma, and now even under Cyril Ramaphosa. And I just need your thoughts on the leadership, the leaders we've had, and what these leaders have actually meant or where they have taken or dragged this country down.
That's in a contested environment. You have to understand what the contestation is about and what form the transition will take. And obviously, what we agreed upon on the 1994 transition, there was a consensus around that. But that was not supposed to last, and the inequality, as was contained in the RDP, or in the document in the RDP, had to be dealt with. But we chose GEAR. And through GEAR, we actually went into a neoliberal World Bank, IMF-inspired process, which, of course, South Africa imposed through its own GEAR without necessarily borrowing money from the IMF and the World Bank. Where we are now, it borrowed very little over a period of time. But where we are now, we are actually taking loans in the IMF and the World Bank. They are not that significant, but they point to a situation where we are actually worse off from the time of the transition in 1994 compared to where we are now. We are in a worse case scenario. And we have allowed inequality to fester. And these things have festered while we have people we call leaders. The task of government is to look and consider the poor of the poorest of the poor. That's what the task of government is. What we are seeing now in terms of privatizing of services is actually to ignore the poor. They must fend for themselves. The government is more regulatory in its outlook, including the fact that it says it can't produce jobs. If it were developmental, it would use those instruments to actually deal with the inequality and thereby attend to the poorest of the poor and alleviate that situation through education, through health, through all those things. Services that were improving, and you could see the effects of that in the general population from about 1996 to about 2010, 2011. There are serious reversals in there. So basically, the key pillars of trying to resolve this were faulty. They didn't address the key issues that Tessa talks about, which is inequality. Unless we actually address inequality, we are not going to be a society that is viable going forward. In our scenarios of inequality, we have the three scenarios of Isi bourgeois, which is trickle-down system that we have had through GEAR and all the other years that came. We've got Naila work, which is actually changing the policies that we have, or rather implementing a set of policies that should take us out of the quagmire we are in. But what we have chosen and progressively chosen with each period are the things that are putting us in what we call the Gwara scenario, where actually things are not functioning and where we have privatized everything, including the poor, privatizing their own space. So everyone fends for themselves. This is where we are now. Under such a situation, I doubt if we can talk about leadership, because leadership is an attribute of actually doing things and demonstrating that you are bold and you are doing things the right way, and the consequences should show. When the consequences of a better life do not show, you cannot talk about leadership. It doesn't exist.
Well, Tessa, as Dr. Pali said, leadership doesn't exist, and we clearly have a leadership vacuum. And we've got a serious problem. We've got a huge problem as far as leadership is concerned, because even sadly, with the current incumbent, who has been trying to put out fires, but fires internally within the ruling party, within the ANC, rather than looking at it from a governance perspective, looking at people, because we know what factionalism has done to the ruling party. And it's about putting out fires, and you put out one and another fire arises. And just your thoughts on the leadership, and how much or how accountable should leadership be held for the situation that we find ourselves in?
I mean, leadership should be held accountable to a very high degree. I've said to people often in the last few months that it's one thing having a leader that has clearly got bad intentions, a malevolent leader who is trying to do bad things with the system, trying to do bad things with the country, and trying to do things towards their own end. And when you have a leader with bad intentions, it's almost a better scenario to having a leader with no intentions and no vision. Because if somebody has bad intentions, you can then see what their intentions are, and you can try and galvanize people, against it. You can try and find ways to circumvent those bad things. But when you have what I think we have in our case, which is leadership with no vision, leadership with no intention, I call it a neglect of power at this point, where we have a president and a cabinet who seem rudderless, who seem like they don't have direction, who seem like they don't have a plan. They seem very reactive, very much about appearances over actual use of power in the correct ways, and also very happy to distribute powers to a commission here and another grouping there and another advisory council here and another advisory council there. And most of it stems from the fact that this leadership does not trust itself. This cohort of government does not trust itself to govern. And so it's trying to get society to govern on its behalf, because the ANC is in shambles because of these fightings and, firefighting that it has to do. And that really shouldn't be the nation's problem. The ANC's internal factional battles are a distraction to the nation. It should not be our problem what happens within the ANC, and the country's future should not be tied to the fate of the ANC. So when people say to me, we all have to back President Cyril Ramaphosa because there's no one else in the ANC, and usually it's ANC people who say that. I often say that in a country of 60 million people, we cannot be told that we are beholden to one party and one party's conference is now going to be the determining factor. We have to look beyond it, and we have to prepare ourselves for what do we do if that never comes right? What do we do if this leadership does not step up? Because corruption is bad, but incompetence is bad too. Corruption is bad, but a visionless society and a society that doesn't function is bad as well. And we can't have those be our choices. We need to look for other ways that we are going to participate in our democracy. Democracy is not the governance of the state, it is the governance of the people. And we must find ways to reinvent our democracy, reinvent our political landscape, and get more citizens engaged in governance themselves. However that looks, we're going to have to figure that out as a country. But the one thing that we cannot do is say that, the leadership of the day is the best that we can do as the country when the country is in this state. That can't be the place that we land on. And I think maybe the important thing to think about in all of this is the question about what kind of society we want to be and what kind of democracy we want to build. And I think we've come to a point that people's disillusionment, again, is not just with one party. It's with a system that we have created, that we've become accustomed to, that we do not think that we can get beyond. We don't feel like we can get beyond big man politics and the parties being the ones who MPs are accountable to, But there are other ways we can do this, and we have to start thinking about how we get people more accountable to people rather than party bosses, and how we ensure that it's the people's voices that determine the political outcomes of this country and not a select few politicians.
Thank you for that, Tessa. Dr. Pali, we've heard the slogans, and just before we get there, I'm just looking at some of the comments that have come through. What a cheek. We should do a Sri Lanka year very soon and put out those palukas. ST says, my exact thought, the same that happened in Sri Lanka must happen here. Plus, when they want to flee the country, like the president of Sri Lanka, then they must also not be allowed to. Where the lights go out, and this is where the president and his ministers live, and they apparently don't get load shedding. Ever is this right? The people who arguably created and who certainly should solve the problem don't experience it. That it comes from Bongani Pingwa, who's made that comment. But again, talking about governance and where are those slogans? And we've heard those slogans over and over again from the ruling party. The people shall govern. A government for the people, by the people. We know about the slogans. Those were popular slogans that were used at one point in time, but it all seemed forgotten, Dr. Pali.
I think when slogans are important, propaganda is very, very important. And by propaganda, I don't mean falsehoods. I mean propagating ideas. It's one thing to do that. It's another to get the hard work to demonstrate that those things are deliverable. We haven't actually had a plan in South Africa. We have had more slogans governing us from the RDP. The RDP was not a plan. The RDP was a set of slogans, a set of desires, and the NDP was just equally a set of desires. It wasn't a plan. In between, we had the 9-point plan, the 5-point plan, the 15-point plan, the new something, whatever it is. And I've been counting all these pseudo things that are called plans, 9 of them. And when we divide that by 28 years, there's been a toy for the nation for Christmas every 3 years. So really working the plan and saying who benefits and who doesn't, and agreeing on those benefits and those who do not, and where we wish to be as South Africa, requires a lot more work than what we have done. In fact, it requires a different orientation. So what has happened is that in time, we found ourselves actually planning for how we will use the money, planning on how we'll eat the money, not how we will deliver specific things to society, such as education and so on. So corruption, in fact, it has been driven by our 3-year cycles of the MTF, which is more about how you spend the money expenditure rather than how you get the services going. So the architecture of our plan is for expenditure, not for real goods and services within which people will have a say and will determine the direction. Added to that, of course, is the big man syndrome of a party that is responsible, that reports upwards rather than reports to society. And that's a problem. It's a serious problem. It's a fundamental problem. So I've argued many a times that we don't have a plan. And many, because we have had so many of these things, say we are tired of plans. I think we are tired of bad things that are called plans, that are not plans at all. If you take, for instance, as we look at the load shedding now, what does the president and the minister of DPME says? They say, now we are more serious. We are going to solve this problem. They can't. This thing has long been coming. We cannot be told these kinds of things and as society we accept them. If you look at the economic recovery and reconstruction plan, at best, it will give you 2% or less than 3% growth for the next 10 years to 2030. Unemployment is going to grow. It's a given based on what we have before us as the so-called plan. Now add to that load shedding. We will be in the worst situation. I think even the manifesto of the ANC at the moment. It is about we'll give you less employment, we'll give you more unemployment, we'll give you more poverty, we'll give you more inequality. And I think they must say it that way. And then as voters, then we'll choose how we vote. Because the plans on the table, the manifestos, are exactly that. They deliver that. So those things should not be sugar-coated. And the society must ask the difficult questions as to how will we know and what are you going to deliver? As I say, currently, all the documents I've looked at, they are giving us more unemployment, less growth, more poverty, more inequality, and less of social cohesion.
Tessa, in your mind, why is society not asking these critical questions that Dr. Pali speaks of?
I think society is asking these questions. I think that we don't always hear each other. Because we speak in different languages, we live in different South Africas, we live in different worlds. We're having different conversations or different platforms. But South Africa is certainly asking these questions. I have the opportunity in the work we do at Rivonia Cycle to travel to different parts of this country and to engage people who are very different from me, who are very different from me in terms of background, in terms of socioeconomic positioning in life, and in terms of what it is that people want. People want very similar things. And South Africans, people say, I've heard politicians often say, South Africans don't care about ideas. South Africans just, want the lights on, and they just, want this to work and that to work. And I disagree. I fundamentally disagree. South Africans care about what the ideas are as well. They care about how democracy functions. They care about the ways in which accountability is shown. They want to understand, and I remember the local government elections, when we were doing pre-consultations before the elections with people. People kept on asking, if I vote for ward councillor X and that person disappoints me, is there a system in law where I can have them removed? People are asking those questions. And I'm not saying they're being asked in a university somewhere. That was asked to me in a hall in Diepsloot. So to say South Africans are just apathetic, and that's why I didn't say voter apathy earlier when I said people are not showing up at the polls. I said voter non-participation, because people are also making choices. They're making choices to say that the system doesn't work for us and therefore we're not going to engage it. They've stopped trying to hold politicians directly accountable because they've realized it's a futile exercise. But that doesn't mean people are doing nothing. They are organizing in their local communities. People are getting, schools to work in the ways that they want them to work. They're getting different things done. And it shouldn't be the responsibility of communities alone to do this work. They should have a functioning government. We all should have a functioning government that supports all our efforts to make our society work. And instead, people feel like they are on their own and they're taking matters into their own hands. So we're seeing the rise of the Operation Dudulas. We're seeing the rise of different formations of people doing things on their own. And that's people saying we are deliberating. We are thinking about what's working and what's not. And we are starting to make our own plans. So it may not look the way that we think it should look, but certainly it's happening that people are thinking through these issues and deciding. Some of it may be less productive than others, but without leadership, that's what will happen. You will have this kind of plethora and just chaotic sense of people trying to find a new center around which to organize and to get the country right. And that's what leadership vacuums produce. And I do want to say, I don't look forward to a Sri Lanka. I don't look forward to us storming a place and having to tear it apart. I don't want us to get there. I think our work is about not getting there. Our work is about, as a society, coming together and saying, if we're going to have a leadership vacuum, how are we going to make sure that we prepare ourselves for it in ways that does not destroy what we have? Because the one thing Sri Lanka reminded me is that people know that it is their country and it is their power. That's why people felt comfortable to go into the president's house and do as they please, because they know it's their state house. It's not the politicians. And the more people feel like that, the more they are emboldened and able to do anything. And we must figure out what it is we're going to do with that energy.
Well, certainly. And also, Dr. Pali, the question arises also in whose interests uh, are our politicians acting? We know corruption, obviously, they've had their own personal interests, but also looking at some of the other external factors. And I know you've mentioned IMF, you've mentioned the World Bank a few times during the course of this discussion. And when one looks at the Sri Lankan scenario that has been playing out, this is a country that was reliant on the World Bank, and also in terms of some of the dictates of institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank, leading to a scenario where the country had actually run out of foreign reserves, and this is the reason why they couldn't buy fuel, and this led to what we've seen happening in Sri Lanka in the last few days. And this is the question, looking at the powers that be, are they working in the interest of some of these external forces that are operating, like, for instance, the IMF and the World Bank?
The Russian-Ukraine war has made a serious revelation. And I think we have to step back and say, given the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, what does South Africa do in relation to global warming, in relation to use of coal and so on? Germany and the UK, who were proponents of a just transition and provided and facilitated a loan of 8.5 billion to South Africa dollars, suddenly they are short of energy. What have they done? They've gone back to coal, importing coal from South Africa. Surely anybody who is thinking properly should sit back and say, these people are saying we shouldn't go for coal, and suddenly they themselves are going for coal. They have the most advanced green economy, that is in terms of solar and wind and everything, far better than South Africa. Yet at the slightest challenge of energy, they go back to coal. We have none of that kind of capacity of these renewables. We don't. Yet we are encouraged to go away from coal. Now the question is, we must stop and say, why should we go for coal? Why have you, Germany and the UK, abandoned the planet? And you are outsourcing the responsibility for the planet to us in South Africa. Of course, in Africa, we are the biggest pollutants. We pollute 90% of the time in Africa. But aggregate for Africa is less than 3%. The rest of the world produces this 97% of the pollutants. Why should we be pushed to stop using coal by those who, at the slightest inconvenience of a winter coming, of energy shortages, rush for coal, and west of that, rush for the South African coal? If we can't ask those questions, then we do not know what our interests are. I'm not saying that we should retreat into a national interest. We have to have a global interest. But partnership is about sharing burdens and not abandoning others in the way UK and Germany have behaved and encouraged us to go for these things, in fact, that they produce, and ask us to import. We'll never solve the problem of unemployment if we conduct ourselves that way. We'll never solve the problem of inequality if we behave that way. I think we are at a point where we really have to make serious choices, preserve what we have in South Africa, the democracy we have, the region of Africa that we have, and act correctly. We have an opportunity to do so, because neoliberalism has failed, and we cannot allow it to swallow us in its failure. We've got to stand up and lift ourselves out of it. That's what needs to be done. And the Ukraine-Russia war has told us how the colonial world has looked upon us, and how it has influenced what policies dominate the world, what economies dominate the world, how they should create poverty for us. Time we have to think for ourselves and do things differently. And
yes, certainly, Dr. Pali. Well, you mentioned, neoliberalism has failed. Capitalism has failed in this country as well. And Tessa, if we look at South Africa, we become more capitalist than the capitalist nations themselves. And this has been proven over and over again. And against all of this, something has got to give. We cannot continue indefinitely with the current scenarios that have been playing out. And here's a question to you, Tessa. What needs to be done?
I mean, there are a few things that I think we need to do. I think we need to reckon with the fact that our country has built itself on an elite pact between economic elites and political elites. And when I say economic elites, it's not even a difficult thing to conceive of. But to be in the top 10% earners in this country, you only need to be earning 20,000 Rand a month. That's the level of our inequality. And so comfort in this country comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of a society that's dysfunctional. And we're going to have to, within the ambit of economic elites, rethink what it means to live in this country and what it means to live well for everyone and at what cost that's going to come to whom. And that does put a gauntlet to us about questions around tax. It does put a gauntlet as to questions around social protection and the ways in which we employ social protection. There are a lot of questions that raises. But of course, on the other side of that, people will say, well, you want to raise our taxes to what Scandinavian countries pay, and then we're going to put it in the hands of a political elite and a leadership that's failing. That's obviously not going to be on the cards for anyone. And so that's why there's also this big question around getting the state competent, getting government competent, and making sure that our politics is a lot more dynamic and a lot more accountable. And so those two things need to happen. We need to have a conversation about what we do to break an elite pact and what we do to make sure that we start to really think about how we have a different kind of distributive justice when it comes to our economics in this country and the way that we run it. But the second part of that is, for that to work, we need to have the security of a government that works, of a public service that works, of a public service that can deliver something as simple as public transport. I mean, we can't deliver something as basic and catalytic as public transport, and that's a failure. So we have to get both of those parts right if we're going to get this country to move forward. And I think it does start by us rethinking our systems, fundamentally rethinking the ways in which we position ourselves in our society, and then asking questions about governance and how we change that.
Yes, I see we've got about 5 minutes before we end this broadcast. Dr. Pali, have we gone too far down the line where the rot has set in so deep that we are unable to get out of the mess, or is there hope?
People always have hope, and they should always have hope. The late Dade Walter Sisulu, whenever he spoke about hope. President Mbeki, whenever he wrote a document, he will always talk about the possibility of giving hope. And I think it is working on not only on the words themselves, but the deep content that goes with that. From people like who were in Robben Island, who when they spoke with Lembede in 1945, they said freedom in our lifetime. And all of them who were with Lembede in 1945 at that meeting survived to see freedom in their lifetime. It is that which I think we should hold hope towards. 28 years is too short a time in a period of in a calendar of a country. And we have made our mistakes, fortunately, in the very first 28 years. We actually have now to make sure that we don't go for another 28 years of this. This is school fees. In addition to having known how the continent of Africa went, the countries that got independence ahead of us. This is the time to ensure that we correct the mistakes. Self-correction that is propounded by the ANC, I think it's a very difficult failure. We need the whole of society to engage in that self-correction program. And that means we will not return to where we were in terms of how we ran our politics or ran our economy. We've got to come to an agreement of how we'll run our economy, how we'll run our politics. And we have to have proof of concept. That means we have to have a design thinking, systems design, systems thinking that will lead to a different future. And that is a lot of work. It's not something like a slogan. It requires slogans, it requires propaganda, but it must be anchored in real knowledge basis, knowledge systems that South Africa has to buy into. And that knowledge resides everywhere in the country. It's not knowledge of the elite. It resides everywhere in the country. And there has to be commitment to that. There has to be monitoring and evaluation of that. And that kind of monitoring and evaluation cannot be the kind of monitoring and evaluation that the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation does. It must be a formative evaluation throughout the process, not a summative evaluation that comes at the end of the process. All those are things that we have to actually focus on, because this country is too precious to fail, because the rest of the continent can fail on its failure.
Well, Tessa, as Dr. Pali says, this country is too precious to fail. Final thoughts?
My final thoughts are this, that he's completely right. It's going to take work and proof of concept. And you might ask, where will that come from? I wrote a piece this week in which I said that the hope of our country is that the soul of the country is being held together by community activists, community organizers, by people who are working in different spaces in the country, by professionals who are playing their trade, and even by civil servants who are trying to do the right thing in some corners of that bureaucracy. And it's really about the things that work need to be scaled. The ideas that matter need to be brought to the fore. The people who are willing and competent need to raise their hands, and we all need to get into a conversation about what we're calling at Rivonia Cycle South Africa 2.0, and really say that it is all of our responsibility to make this future possible and make this future happen. And I think there are a few big conversations in the country. One of them is electoral reform, and really thinking about whether our elections allow us to get the best people and the most accountable system. One of them is questions around social protection. Another one is a question around safety. We are an unsafe country. People feel unsafe and insecure. And one of the big ones as well is around food security and people's sense that they just don't have the kind of social net that will catch them at the point of hunger. There are some big conversations to be had and an agenda I think we need to set as this country for 2024 that says these are the things that anyone who wants to be in government must understand, agree to, and action.
Well, Tessa Dooms and also Dr. Pali Lehohla, I must say I appreciate you taking time out, both of you, talking to us here on Wednesday nights with myself, with Inayet Wadee here at Salam Media. We do appreciate your time, and hopefully we will have a lot more of these discussions going into the future. I think it was absolutely necessary, but shed a lot of light, added a lot of value to our viewers and our listeners this evening. And for that, we thank you and we wish you all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of part one of tonight's broadcast. We still have got part two from 8 to 9 p.m. We are talking about Sri Lanka. The question we are raising is what is next for Sri Lanka. We'll be joined by Shashika Bandara and Donovan Williams immediately after this. We're going to go for a break. We'll be back. Stay with us.